All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. Happy Saturday, everybody. Hope all of you guys are having a great weekend. Our cadence during the NBA Finals is going to be, obviously, the live shows on the night of, film session the second day. That third day, we're either going to do an interview or we're going to do a mailbag. So, like, we've got Sam Vecini coming on Monday next week. That'll actually air on Tuesday, but it'll be our kind of like interview-based reaction to the first two games of the series. For game one, though, we're doing a mailbag. So I've got a mailbag. I sent out a tweet earlier today. We had 70-something questions. I appreciate all of you guys for participating. Obviously, we can't get to all of them, but we're going to get to as many as we can. We're going to be bouncing all throughout the NBA Finals, around the league, and some off-court stuff in this mailbag. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Hoops Tonight YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at @JasonLT so you guys don't miss show announcements. Don't forget about our podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. And then keep dropping mailbag questions in the YouTube comments so we can keep hitting them throughout the rest of the summer. All right, let's talk some basketball. First question. What's the concern level if you're Dallas that Boston completely owned the lower third of the court defensively? 23 for 47, 49% in the paint. Took away their lobs by nullifying the 1-5 pick and roll. Only got 3 corner three-point attempts. Went 1 for 3 by staying home and trusting defenders in space. So yeah, that was my major concern coming into this series, just how different Dallas's pick and roll attack was going to look in this series by virtue of an adjustment that honestly, I was surprised Minnesota didn't try. I'm surprised Minnesota didn't try putting Jaden McDaniels onto Gafford or Lively and just have Gobert guard a Derek Jones or a PJ Washington to try to disrupt the spacing of Dallas in pick and roll. To put it simply, if you allow Dallas to screen with their center, then they have traditional 4-out spacing. Shooter in the corner, shooter in the corner, shooter on the opposite wing, screen. Both guys are rolling hard to the basket, or one's driving, one's rolling to the basket, right? So the paint is effectively empty with two guys kind of attacking the rim, right? As soon as you switch that matchup to where they have to bring the center into the ball screen, they have to use a wing instead of their center. Now the spacing gets all janked up, right? Because now it's corner, but instead of this wing being occupied by a shooter, it's vacant. That guy's setting the screen. And then the center is sitting in the dunker spot with Tatum on him with his ass parked right underneath the rim. And so it just screws up the spacing of everything. And then PJ Washington or Derek Jones Jr. has the predicament of like either rolling into all that traffic, even though they're not great vertical spacers, or popping into that vacancy above the break where they're not very good above the break three-point shooters. And so that problem is not going away. We talked about some specific things in our film session yesterday. One, trying to set more RAM screens. So basically having Derek Jones or PJ Washington, instead of screening for Luka, just sprint down and screen Tatum as hard as you can. And then maybe Tatum will forfeit a switch there so that when Lively or Gafford runs up, you just have to have Lively sprint up into the screen, which will probably bring Porzingis with him if Tatum switches. Then you have to have whoever screened Tatum quickly relocate back out to the wing so that they have the space necessary to operate. That's one thing they can do, looking to attack less out of ball screens and more out of the post or an ISO, but not targeting Horford, who switched incredibly well in game one, but maybe attacking the smaller guards instead. That's an angle that they can look to go through. Just in general, they've got to move with a lot more pace. I thought the ball pressure from Jaylen Brown got them into a lot of late clock situations as well. But here's the thing. None of those are clean, easy solutions, right? Like, it's going to be hard to set a pin down on Tatum. He might just fight through it and then follow Lively or Gafford up into the screen, right? Like, it's not going to be easy. There's not an easy solution here. This is kind of a tough matchup because of Tatum's size. It's a tough matchup for Dallas in this sense. So I don't see that problem going away entirely, but Dallas certainly can do a better job. But Boston dominating the lower third of the court defensively is a big part of just what their advantages are in this series, and it may not go away entirely. Let's see. Next question. Does LeBron not being involved in the Lakers coaching decision and them looking to go with a development coach in Hurley more so point to LeBron being open to leaving LA this offseason or retiring soon in your eyes? I don't see that as what's happening here. I think LeBron's going to stay, and I think he'll play at least 2 more seasons. I think the Dan Hurley piece actually represents the best of both worlds here, because in the post LeBron phase, you've got a coach that's excellent with development and scouting and development. You've got a coach that will instill a culture that will last for years after LeBron James is gone. But also, I actually think he's a great tactician for this particular roster. He, with UConn, had a lot of success generating space with a team that had multiple non-shooters on the floor through specifically through off-ball action. So think of it like this. When you're running ball screens like Dallas does, where you have Luka having a center set a pick and you got shooters in the corners and a shooter on the opposite wing. Let's think more in the Minnesota framework where the floor is more spaced. When that's the case, help defense is pretty standard, right? Like the guy in the opposite corner is going to kind of try to find a sweet spot in between the block in the corner where he can help but also rotate. The guy on the opposite wing is going to come pretty close to the nail. Same thing on the strong side corner. Like the drop coverage big is going to run a drop. Like the spacing is pretty standard and you could really load up on the ball, right? Like that's one of the downsides of 4-out 1-in offense is there's not a lot of ball and player movement, right? But when you run action off the ball, so that let's imagine the Lakers, for instance. If you have LeBron James and Anthony Davis running a ball screen on the right side of the floor, and you have guys just standing like wing, a little bit further on the wing corner, those guys all can sink into the lane and they can have their kind of attention geared up on the ball screen where they can help. One of the things that Dan Hurley's great at is keeping help defenders occupied with action. So if you have those three guys on the weak side running like a double wide pin down where the first guy curls around the first screen and then the second guy curls around the second screen and they're just like doing shit on the opposite side of the court, those three help defenders, now their mental, their focus is geared towards that action. And so they have a decision to make. They can either gear up on the action and then not help on the ball screen. Now LeBron and AD are cooking. Or they can favor the ball screen and you could leave an opening for a shooter on the weak side because you're not, or a cutter on the weak side because you're not paying attention to the action. Dan Hurley is big on ball and player movement and making sure that, especially when you've got a team like the Lakers that's going to have Anthony Davis who can't shoot and Jared Vanderbilt who can't shoot, because Jared Vanderbilt, if he's healthy next year, is probably going to start at small forward. So like with that type of configuration, like you're going to need ball and player movement to maintain space, to maintain your threats offensively. And I think Dan Hurley is a perfect fit for that. So like, I like his schematic approach to maximize this Laker roster while also being the future of the franchise in the sense that he can scout and develop young players and also establish a culture that lingers long after LeBron is gone. I think it's a perfect fit, and I'm very hopeful that they can get a deal done. What can Dallas do defensively to mitigate being in so many help rotation situations leading to open Boston threes? Based on my observations, I think it's worth considering not pressuring the ball handlers so far out. This was a really good take. When I watched the film, it was something I noticed, but I didn't actually put in my film session last night. But there were several possessions where Dallas players were picking up ball pressure close to half court, and then they get beat, and then they're in rotation before they even get a chance to set their defense. And so that's a good adjustment, like playing a more passive defense where you're just working on containing the ball, right? Like in general, with Boston, if you play off of them, they have a tendency to settle on some pull-up threes. Now, you got to be careful because guys like Tatum and Brown are good at seeing a defender on their heels, giving space, and driving at them at one angle and then crossing over or getting into their body and spinning off. So sometimes being on your heels can work to your detriment if you're not good at actually absorbing contact and staying in front. But in general, there's not really a lot in terms of scheme that you can do differently. You just have to do a better job. Guys, just like when it comes to Boston driving, kicking from a spaced out floor, the job is simple. You have to contain the basketball. If you contain the basketball, you prevent help defense from being engaged. If you prevent help defense from being engaged, you prevent spot up opportunities on the weak side, which are going to be more efficient than a loaded up ISO. You need to basically take it so that the spot up attempts go down and the ISO attempts go up. And the more you do that, the better chance you give yourself to get stops against the Boston Celtics. This is an interesting one. What is a better set of third, fourth, and fifth options? The 2024 Celtics with Drew Holiday, Derek White, and Kristaps Porzingis, or the 2017 Warriors with Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, and Andre Iguodala? Really interesting question, but I think it's the 2017 Warriors. Klay Thompson was at this point the second best shooter in the league, is the second best shooter of all time, and he also was an elite perimeter defender. Unfortunately, he hasn't gotten the recognition he deserves for it over the course of his career, but he's an elite perimeter defender. Draymond Green is the second best defensive player of this era, in my opinion, obviously. And then he's a guy that keeps their offense flowing with his ability to function as like a dribble handoff fulcrum in their 5-out offense. And then Andre Iguodala is probably the second best perimeter defender of the era behind Kawhi Leonard. Drew Holiday, Derek White, and Kristaps Porzingis are really good players. I don't think they're on that level, though. And again, there's no shame in that. The 2017 Warriors, in my opinion, are the greatest basketball team ever assembled in the history of the NBA. We're this close to crowning a new NBA champion, and with the action heating up on the court, it's even hotter at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. And DraftKings Sportsbook has you covered every step of the way with same-game parlays, live betting, odds boosts, and so much more. Don't miss out as the NBA postseason winds down. It's super easy to get started with DraftKings if you're a first-timer. Try betting on something like a team to win. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app, select your team, and place your first bet. It's that simple. The odds in the NBA Finals right now, you can get the Celtics to win at -210, or if you're into the underdog Dallas Mavericks, they're at +175. And if you're new to DraftKings, you got to check this out. New customers bet $5 to get $150 in bonus bets instantly. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code HOOPS. That's HOOPS. That's code HOOPS for new customers to get $150 in bonus bets when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Here we go. Non-NBA related, but can you explain the Sith Grand Plan again from Star Wars? For some reason, I started to get so interested in Star Wars lore. You know me, geeky Jason, Star Wars. I'm like, yes, let's do this. First of all, the Acolyte premiere came out, the first 2 episodes. It was awesome. My buddy Luke and I did full reaction to it. That's on my other podcast feed. That's the Two Sons podcast. You can find that on YouTube just under there. Two Sons podcast. Have a full reaction to the first 2 episodes of the Acolyte. We'll also have a reaction. We'll also have a reaction to episode 3 coming out about pretty late on Tuesday. Is it Tuesday? Yeah, I think it's Tuesday night. So keep an eye on the feeds on Tuesday night as well. I'll have another one, but hop over to that feed, subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Check out some of the Star Wars content. Sith Grand Plan, pretty simple. So the Sith for thousands of years were many. They were numerous, right? And they are the Sith are very inwardly focused and selfish, so they would just betray each other. Like anytime a powerful Sith would rise, multiple lesser Sith would team up and they would overthrow him. Whereas with the Jedi, they always worked in concert with each other. They were selfless. They were all in on the larger goal. And so anytime there'd be a major galactic conflict, the Sith would try to attack and they would fail. Sometimes they get close, but they would fail, and they'd fail the same way every time. They'd splinter and they'd fall apart, whereas the Jedi would come together. And so Darth Bane, 1,000 years before the Phantom Menace, identified this problem and realized that that was a weakness in the Sith Order, so he actually manipulated and killed all of the Sith. And so it was just him and his apprentice. He instituted what's called the Rule of Two, where there'd be one Sith who would embody the power and then a second Sith who would crave the power and then eventually take it from him. From there, he understood they'll never beat the Jedi through force of arms because the Jedi will always come together. So they had to find a different way to beat the Jedi and overthrow the Republic, right? And so the person who first referred to it as the Grand Plan was Darth Plagueis, but it actually initiated with Darth Bane. And the idea was you're going to work underneath the surface. You're going to work with subterfuge and cunning, and you're going to try to sabotage from the shadows the Republic, right? And so there was a plan that took shape over the course of 1,000 years through accumulation of resources and political influence and all these different things. And basically, Plagueis and Palpatine executed the final phase of the Grand Plan. But essentially, from the way, if you've ever read the book Darth Plagueis, I highly recommend it. But in the book Darth Plagueis, he actually breaks down how essentially the thought process was he wanted to foster division between the inner core worlds and the outer rim worlds, and basically make it so that the core worlds were prospering while the outer core worlds were suffering through a lot of hardship, right? And from there, he wanted to basically force the galaxy to turn on itself so that it would go to war. And then he used the clones as the vehicle in the war to kill all of the Jedi through Order 66, right? Like Plagueis actually hatched that entire plan. Palpatine just executed it. And like, it's really, like, in my opinion, it's just like really good world building and lore. And I'm obviously a huge Star Wars nerd. So like, I apologize for the people in this who are listening to this episode who aren't big Star Wars nerds, but that's like a little short, quick synopsis of what the Sith Grand Plan is. But again, I did talk a ton of that shit on my Two Sons podcast with my buddy Luke. So hop over there and check that out. Assuming Boston can finally get over the hump, do they go into next season as the favorites? Or does a team out west like Minnesota or Denver get the nod because of the matchup? So I actually only viewed two teams on the top tier going into the postseason, Boston and Denver. Denver was the only team that I like. Minnesota was an interesting one matchup wise because of their a couple things with Minnesota that I really liked for a matchup with for Boston. Really good defense that I thought could cause some issues for Boston, and also Boston can struggle to protect the rim sometimes. Now with Porzingis and Gobert, that might have been an issue, and I don't know who I would have picked between Minnesota and Boston. I would have needed to prep. I don't know, but the only team I would have actually certainly picked over Boston was Denver, and they lost to a tough matchup in the Western Conference. So the next question is, what will the top tier look like next season? Because I don't necessarily view Dallas on that tier. What will that tier look like next season? I think Boston is in that tier again. I think Denver's in that tier again. Maybe Dallas, maybe Minnesota. Oklahoma City, I think, is a team you look at getting back into that tier. Memphis could be really interesting. We'll see when we get into next season how all the teams shape up. But to me, Boston is going to be on that top tier again until that starting lineup gets broken up. I don't think they're like head and shoulders above everybody. I think they are beatable. They're just a really bad matchup for Dallas, which is something that I've been talking about over the course of all of our prep. And they might, there are teams out west that do match up more favorably with Boston. So as is always the case, what did I say to Denver fans at the beginning of the season? You guys, I'm picking you as the favorite, right? But it's more likely than not that you lose because that's just what NBA history tells us, right? And then I got to a point where I was more optimistic with Denver, right? Remember I said I expect them to win unless they get an injury to their starting five. Well, Jamal Murray got injured and played like shit, and that ended up being something that brought their ceiling down just enough for them to blow a 20-point lead in Game 7 against Minnesota, right? So, again, I tend to think this is pretty even at the top among a handful of teams. I don't know who that handful of teams is going to be at the start of next season, but Boston will definitely be there. Denver will definitely be there. Out of Trey, DeJounte, Cade, LaMelo, and Simons, who would be the best fit on the Spurs? I actually want them to go after Darius Garland. I think he'd be a perfect fit alongside Victor Wembanyama in terms of timeline, in terms of a pick and roll threat that can both score and pass, kind of an opportunity. I think you can get him at a discount too. I think the Spurs can afford to overpay him for a few years. I think Darius Garland is the guy that I would go after. What's the reason you had for that poll between Jayson Tatum and AD? So I put a poll. I said, who's a better basketball player, Jayson Tatum or AD? And it went crazy viral, and there were thousands and thousands of votes, and it was really close. I think Tatum finished at 52-48 as the better player. And all it was is whenever I have an opportunity to present a poll that I think will be close to 50-50, I'll send it out just because I think that's fun. But the reasoning is pretty simple. I think Jayson Tatum and AD are very close to each other. I think they're on a similar tier as players. Now they're very different, right? Tatum's a better offensive player, AD's a better defensive player. Tatum is a little more consistent, AD is a little more volatile, but AD's ceiling is higher, Tatum's ceiling is lower, right? So there's all these differences between them, but I view them as more or less on the same tier in the sense that they're clearly not as good as the guys at the top of the league, but I think both of them could be the best player on a championship team if they're surrounded with enough talent. And so that was kind of my thought process behind putting them on the same level. But to be clear, I don't think either of them are at the top of the league. I just wanted to give an opportunity to compare the two of them. Early in the season, And to start the playoffs, you had the opinion that Denver could be the next dynasty in the NBA. With a possible Celtics title and the team staying together for at least next year, how do you feel about the Celtics dynasty or Boston, Denver in the coming years? Great show. I absolutely think if the Celtics win this year, they could. A dynasty is a loaded word because, like, how many teams have really been dynasties in NBA history? Like, we're talking about the Warriors, the Spurs, the Lakers in the early 2000s, the Bulls. Like, there's just not a lot of examples of them, right? I do think a lot of people are writing off Denver, and I think that's stupid. I think Denver's going to be right back in the mix at the top of the league next season. I think Boston will be right in the mix at the top of the league next season. So, like, it's very possible that over this 4 or 5 year span, we get 2 Denver titles, 2 Boston titles. Like, that's all on the table. I just don't think with how talented the league is, I don't think anybody's going to be running like 3, 4 in a row. Are we going to see teams lean more towards 5-out offense in the future? I think so. I think you're seeing some of the limitations of 4-out with Dallas in this series, just in the sense that they one simple personnel adjustment has like rendered their offense severely limited. So, like, I think ball and player movement is a great counter to any defensive approach. And in general, like, it opens the door for better matchups. Like, if you want to prevent Tatum ending up in one place or Porzingis ending up in another, a great way to do that is just lots of reversing the floor, reversing the side of the floor that the ball's on, multiple actions in the same possession. That sort of thing is a great way to counter that. And so I do think more and more teams will see the value of that in the long run. Not really a question, but the Celtics going from playing the Pacers' crazy up-tempo, fast-paced offense, especially the games Halliburton played, to this slow, non-off-ball movement offense has to feel so much easier. Easier is the wrong word, I think. It's just different. Like, this puts a lot more pressure on your individual defenders to hold up against the best player in the world, potentially, in Luka Doncic, and one of the best ISO players in Kyrie Irving. And so, even though it's different, it's still very hard. It's just different. Assuming they get him, how do you see Dan Hurley's offensive-defensive schemes translating to LA, and how will his playbook help generate easier looks for Braun and AD? Great show as always. Keep it up. I went over the offensive part earlier. It's just like off-ball action to occupy help defenders, using Vanderbilt and Anthony Davis more as screeners than spot-up players, different things like that to manufacture spacing without shooting on the floor. But I'm not going to go any more into that because you saw that earlier in the show. I have not looked into Dan Hurley's defensive approach yet. If he gets hired, I will, and we will cover it in the film session. If the Mavs lose this series, would Luka still have the bragging rights title with no MVPs and championships, or can he play well enough in a loss and still have the title going into the summer? Here's the thing. I think Luka he played like shit in game 1. Don't let the box score fool you. He played like shit. He was so bad on the defensive end, and he wasn't good enough offensively when it mattered. But I think he's been the most impressive player in this postseason run so far. So, like, we'll see how that all dust settles at the end of the series. I do think Luka will play better. But, like, if Luka plays poorly for the entire series, like, that's going to be something we're going to have to look at. But again, at the end of the postseason run, I'm going to do 2 separate lists, and one of them will be who had the best season, right? Like, who gets the bragging rights for this season? And right now, I do think Luka still maintains his spot at number 1. Hey, Jason, in the video with Colin, you said you were in real estate. How and why did you make the switch? In a similar situation, and I'm questioning, should I pursue a passion in basketball and media? I love the vids and analysis. So I got into real estate simply because that was, to me, the most flexible career for me to be able to pursue something in basketball media. Now, real estate's tricky. There's a bunch of different jobs in real estate. There are salaried jobs. There are transaction coordination, like administration jobs. And then there's like the investment side where I worked for a while. And then there's residential real estate, like just being an agent, which I did that as well. And when you on the salary side, the investment side, I was on salary, so it was a little easier to manage in terms of like the month-to-month budgeting. But like when I was in the residential side, like it's super volatile. Like I had months where I made a lot of money, and I had months where I made zero money, right? And like one of the big things I learned when I did that for a living, it's 100% commission. So it's like you got to be really, really self-motivated, and you have to put in the work. It's all about lead generation. So like for me, I was just holding a ton of open houses to meet new clients, and that was what floated my business. But again, like That's a great job. That's super flexible, the residential real estate side, if you want to pursue a passion, but you won't make money unless you put in the work. So it's a delicate balance. It's not like you just get your real estate license and money starts coming in. You have to sell houses. And so it's a difficult job, but if you can figure out how to do it, then that is a very flexible job to allow you to pursue to pursue something like sports media on the side. As far as the sports media side, just start making content. Get a camera, get a mic, put it out on a podcast feed, put it on YouTube, put it on social media, and just see where it goes. And lastly, I would just say be yourself. Don't try to pretend to be someone else. Just authentically talk about whatever it is your topic is, the way you want to talk about it, and see where it goes from there. People can see through it when you're not being authentic. What was Boston doing better than the Wolves in the last round in terms of dribble penetration? Why was Ant's drive not nearly as effective as Jaylen Brown and Tatum's yesterday's? Why is it because of KP's spacing or lack of effort from Luka and Kyrie? It's simply because the spacing that Boston provides in general. It's not just Porzingis. It's Boston always has 5 shooters on the floor. They did not play a single non-shooter while the game was in question yesterday. Even the guys off the bench, Porzingis, Pritchard, and Hauser, all great shooters. And so Minnesota, with Gobert and Jaden McDaniels and Kyle Anderson and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, it's just the Mavs could pack the paint. And most importantly, Gafford and Lively were just parked under the rim the entire time. And so even though Ant's a better driver than anybody in a Boston Celtics jersey, it just doesn't matter because the spacing isn't there. Who's your second favorite player of all time after LeBron? Steph Curry. And the main reason why is I know because I actually watched him. I've always been a big Kobe and MJ fan, but I didn't start watching basketball until the mid 2000s or to the late 2000s, and at that point Kobe was kind of already starting to fade. Obviously, I'm a huge Kobe fan, huge Michael Jordan fan, but like in terms of like the majority of my basketball fanhood, Steph Curry was the guy that I enjoyed watching the most other than LeBron. Super unique, savage competitor, really good leader, genuinely just an awesome television watch. Just Steph to me was my second favorite player to watch. If the Rockets had beaten the Warriors in the 2018 Western Conference Finals, who do you think would have won the finals between them and the Cavs with Chris Paul coming off a hamstring injury? I've had this take before, but like I think LeBron was so much better than James Harden at that point as a playoff player. I know Harden won the MVP, but like Harden just did a bunch of damage in the regular season. I think if Chris Paul was injured, that the Cavs would have won. But if Chris Paul had somehow been able to come back and play in that series, then I think Houston would have won. Why do you think Jaylen Brown is so underrated? To me, he was obviously one of the 15 best players in the league this year and didn't even make All-NBA. Also, it makes no sense that only one Boston player made it. Actually, it makes a lot of sense. They have 5 $30 million players in an open market, and there aren't just 15 $30 million players in the league. There's a hell of a lot more than that, right? I want to say there's, I'll have to look, but I'm sure there's 40, 50 players that make at least $25 million a year, right? Like there's just a lot of players that make a lot of money. I think that where I rank him, we'll see after the season. But I don't think it's just like a sure thing that he's one of the top 15 players in the league. I think that's debatable. I think I don't even want to have a take on it because I haven't thought enough about it. As far as whether or not he's underrated, let's be real about what's happening here. The top 15 players in the league generally have major offensive responsibilities for their team. We know what it looks like when Jaylen Brown has major offensive responsibilities. He's not consistent enough as a guy who breaks down the defense to be in that role. He is a part of why he's looked so good with this team is it's allowed him to operate with an advantage a lot, and 2, focus his energies on the defensive end of the floor where he's a top tier athlete. So like a lot of this is Boston, by virtue of Brad Stevens, has surrounded Jaylen Brown with so much talent that like his weaknesses are just not exploitable the way that they are in other systems. So I don't think it's fair when you look at, like, let's take another guy who's in that same range, like Damian Lillard. I think I had him at 13 or 14 coming into this season. Dame's job on Milwaukee is way, 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 way harder than Jaylen Brown's on the offensive end of the floor. Like they live and die based on what he can do and what Giannis can do, right? Whereas with Jaylen Brown, it's like, Derek White runs the action a lot of the game. Drew Holiday will co-op possessions. Like Tatum obviously is the number one. Like there's just so much talent in Boston that it allows Jaylen Brown's strengths to rise to the surface and his weaknesses to sink. Even just last year, without Porzingis and without Drew Holiday, you saw how much more Boston needed from Jaylen Brown and how much more damaging it was when he couldn't actually fulfill his end of the bargain in that sense. So like, I'm not trying to undercut what Jaylen Brown's doing, but all I'm saying is like, there's context here. This team is really good and it makes the job really easily. It's like when Kevin Durant went to Golden State. There were so many people around that team who were like, holy shit, he's the best player in the league. He's better than LeBron. And it's like, he's literally playing in a system where the game is so easy for him. That doesn't mean Kevin Durant's not awesome. It's just context. We literally saw him in Oklahoma City look significantly less efficient the previous season, right? So like, again, the context is important here. Jaylen Brown's awesome. He may be top 15. We'll see when I do my list after the season, but he's in a system right now that accentuates his strengths and minimizes his weaknesses because of how much talent is on the roster. And lastly, the only definitive top 15 player on the roster was Tatum. So that's why he's the only guy who made All-NBA. It's really that simple. I've seen a lot of people trying to dismiss last night's Celtics performance by saying how we just got hot and how we won't repeat it again. But with this Celtics team, I feel like these types of nights are built into their identity and their style of play allows them to have multiple. So I do think they'll do it again, at least once. Like I said before the series, I think they'll have 2 blowout wins in this series. Also, like the shot quality is replicable. Like the problems that Boston presented aren't going away, but they also shot really well in that first half. To put it simply, they went up 29. Like we all think, most of us picked Boston to beat Dallas, right? But we picked Boston to beat Dallas in a competitive-ish series, right? Like we don't think that they're just going to beat the shit out of them every single time they play. When Boston shoots like that, they'll beat the shit out of them. But let's just take that exact same first half, but 5 of those threes don't go in. Now instead of being up 29, you're up 14. You're still up 14 in the NBA Finals in the first half. That's still a dominant performance, right? So like, yeah, the Celtics shot really well, but they got really good high quality shots and they were so much better that even if they hadn't shot as well, they still would have won. So like again, over the course of the series, they will have performances. I think Boston will win a game in this series where they don't shoot well. Like I think that's something that'll happen. So like, again, what happened last night is replicable in terms of shot quality. And when you get that type of shot quality consistently, you will have nights where you shoot it well. When they shoot it well, they'll blow them out. That was kind of why I had that take that they'll have multiple blowouts. What moves, if any, does Denver need to make in order to get back to the 2023 postseason levels of dominance? All I think they need to do is retain KCP and make one addition to the bench, preferably an athletic guard, like a guy that can beat people off the dribble, an athletic guard with the ball in his hands, right? If they can do that, I think they're going to be right back in the mix. I think a lot of people are writing off Denver for losing in the second round when they were up 20 in Game 7 in the second half. And if they won that series, I would have picked them over Dallas. And if they would have won that series, I would have picked them over Boston. So like it really is a game of inches. They caught a bad matchup. They got tired. They blew a big lead in the second half. But Denver's going to be right back in the mix next year. What counters do you expect the Mavs will employ against the Celtics' tendency to switch on screens? I went over a bunch of counters in the film session, so I'm not going to go in too much more detail. But one, avoiding attacking Horford and targeting the smaller guards instead. We talked about ram screens to try to bring Porzingis into the action against a lob threat like Gafford and Lively. That would allow potentially unlock some stuff in their pick and roll game. But mostly, Luka and Kyrie just have to do a better job. 0.54 points per ISO is not going to cut it. Last question. What guitars do you have? Okay, I'm going to move the microphone a little bit here so I can show you. So I have this one. This was my first PRS. This is a CE24 semi-hollow. Really fun guitar. 24 frets, really easy to play. And the main thing with the CE24 is it's a bolt-on. So you can see how it's got the neck actually bolted on instead of glued. And then it's got steel trim. So it's a steel bridge. And then steel trim up top, and so it kind of has like a resonance to it that's kind of unique to a steel. This one right here is a Fender Stratocaster, pretty standard I love the vintage colors on this one, but just a Fender Stratocaster. We have, let's see here. This is my pride and joy. This is the most expensive guitar that I own, and one of the two that I play most frequently. This is a hollow body piezo. So the main thing with it is it's completely hollow. So there's two maple pieces, one on the back and one on the front. And then it's mahogany around the side and a mahogany neck that's glued in. And then the main thing is it's got their vintage style humbuckers. These are what they call the 5815s. They're like a kind of like a vintage sounding tone, super warm. Think similar to like what you'd see in like a Les Paul, but these are beautiful sounding. I'm obsessed with these. And then this bridge has what's called a piezo pickup in it, which makes it sound like an acoustic guitar, which I really like. This one is my second favorite to play, and I think is the prettiest guitar that I own. I like this one a lot. And then lastly, oh God, all right, here we go. This is my favorite guitar to play. This is the Silver Sky. This is John Mayer's signature guitar. It's basically like a Fender Stratocaster, but PRS's version. I won't go into too much detail geeking out about it, but like love the maple neck. I think it's the prettiest maple neck that I've seen on a guitar. I love this kind of like rust, kind of like it's like this just kind of reminds me of Arizona, which I really like. And then it's just got a really classic Stratocaster sound that I really like. And then it's just so well built. It's got a really rounded radius. This one's a 7-inch radius, so it's rounded. Easy to get your fingers around. This is like if you've anybody who listens to the show who's played a Silver Sky knows it's like literally one of the best guitars funnest guitars to play. It's also like relatively affordable compared to some of the core models that PRS makes. Like the purple guitar is more than twice as much as that one. But yeah, and then I've got a couple of cheapies, a couple of Epiphones, like entry level ones, and then I've got an acoustic guitar over there as well. All right, guys, that is all I have for today. As always, I sincerely appreciate you guys for supporting the show. We will be back on Sunday night with a live reaction with Colin Cowherd after Game 2. I will see you guys then.